This week on Quadriga, terror in Paris. Is it war? After the devastating attacks on the French capital, the country is in mourning and watching to see how French President Francois Hollande will react. He says France is now at war and has asked other European nations for military backing. France has declared a state of emergency. Raids are taking place across the country. The French Air Force has also dramatically stepped up strikes against IS positions in Syria. But can IS terror really be stopped with military force? Coming to you from Berlin, Quadriga, the international debate. Your host, Melinda Crane.
Hello and welcome to Quadriga. Is the rhetoric of war suitable and useful or counterproductive? That's one of the questions we want to talk about today on Quadriga with three people who are following the incidents in France and their aftermath very closely. It's a pleasure to welcome Ulrike Guérot. She's a political analyst and the founder and director of the think tank European Democracy Lab. She lived for many years in Paris and has family there. She says the decisive question is, do we defend our values or our security? And very glad to have Asiem el Difraoui on the show. He's a German-Egyptian expert on Islamism who's working with the Candid think tank based here in Berlin. He's currently living in France, and he says the fight against IS cannot be fought solely with military resources. And finally, great to have Alan Posener back on the show. He's a British-born commentator for the daily newspaper Die Welt. He says, of course it's war, and has been since the fatwa was issued against Salman Rushdie 25 years ago. Radical Islam wants to eradicate the West, and the West will not have peace until radical Islam has been eradicated. Asiem el Difraoui, your opening statement says military resources alone won't defeat ISIS. Would you nonetheless agree with the Pope when he says that we are in a piecemeal World War III?
I wouldn't call it World War III. Let's not exaggerate. We are confronted with a global ideology, that's true, and which needs to be, I don't want to use the, we need to find a new terminology. We are in a global conflict against an ideology which we can't win only militarily. So if France is bombing Raqqa, fine, might be necessary. If we liberate territory under ISIS control, very important. But there's not only ISIS. I mean, we have a very short-term memory, it seems, in a sense that all that started in the Afghan war against the Soviet Empire, where we used the most reactionary elements, where we instrumentalized the most reactionary elements of the Muslim world in order to defeat the Russian Empire. We defeated the Russian Empire, but now those elements might defeat us in many ways. So jihadism is an ideology which has a foothold nearly all around the world. Let's look at places like Libya, Yemen, but also Indonesia. Look what happened in our societies. So if we want to defeat jihadism, we need to have a really comprehensive approach in the sense that we need to defeat them intellectually, ideologically. We need to eradicate, and I really use this word eradicate, the socio-economic misery on which those people feed. In Europe, it might be an anti-culture, you know, some anti-culture of jihad, which drags in young people. But in the Middle East, we have real huge socio-economical issues which we need to eradicate in order that ISIS or the other jihadi movements can't anymore feed on those real problems.
Many thanks. Alan Posener, you say this is a war between radical Islam and the West, but most of the pieces in
What's this term? I need to interrupt because that's something we are also in a war of words. What is radical Islam? I don't know what radical Islam is. Let's talk about jihadism. Don't use this polarized word. What's radical Christianity? So we are also in a war of words. Let's find the appropriate terminology. Sorry about that.
Okay, let's let Alan Posener tell us, first of all, how he sees radical Islam. What do you mean when you say that we need to eradicate radical Islam?
Well, I agree with Aziz, actually. I mean, it is a war, and let's not talk about a war of words where we all know what this is about. There is a certain, shall we say, someone said that in the Christian context, you might say Islam has a problem with sects. With radical sects, just the way, right? And
better.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to, really, let's not get into definitions when we basically know what we're talking about. And I agree with you. This is like the confrontation with communism. Again, I agree. We had a a world conflict with communism which had to be confronted militarily, which had to be confronted. It was a war of ideas, and communism fed, at least in the Third World, also on poverty and the feeling of disenfranchisement, and the West had to confront it in all fronts, and we called this the Cold War. The Cold War. And this is what the war against radical Islam or jihadism is. It is a cold and hot war.
Alan, your opening statement also said it's a war between radical Islam and the West. But if I look at the different pieces in this piecemeal the World War III, if in fact it can be called that, most of them are by no means in Europe. We've seen the recent attacks in Beirut and Sinai, assuming that the Russian plane was in fact brought down by IS. And by far the most victims from most jihadist attacks are in the countries of Iraq, Syria, Nigeria, Afghanistan, Pakistan. So is it really a war with the West?
Yeah, well, I mean, totally agree again with what you said about the fact that Muslims are the main victims of jihadism, right? Or radical Islam, or whatever you want to call it. They are the main victims of terror. But these Muslims, these moderate, whatever you want to call them, Muslims, these Muslims just want to get onto the life. It's not... These are people who I include in the West. I'm not excluding them as the other, as people who don't belong to us, because they do belong to us. They want the same things we want. They want democracy. They want a say in the running of their country. They want a similar way of life. It's no accident that Beirut was known as the Paris of the Occident, because it was that they wanted to be like Paris. This is why people in Beirut were so hurt by the attacks in Paris, as if even more than the attacks in their own city, because this was their dream city. So the West is much more than just this island of Europe or the United States. It is an idea.
And that was exactly what Ulrike Guérot was getting at when she talked about the trade-off between our values and our security. But again, if in fact most jihadist attacks are taking victims in the Middle East and Africa, is our security truly so threatened that we must be prepared to trade off our civil liberties?
Well, I mean, first, I wouldn't say that we should treat out our liberties. I'm pretty concerned about what is actually going on with this exception state of France, which is basically eroding liberties. You have no more assembly freedom in France. You can arrest people. I mean, we already see a clear erosion of security liberties that we have, and we shouldn't let go. We have seen in Germany, for instance, that we didn't have a football play, which is basically we're going into the trap of ISIS, which is what they want. We are stopping our lives in the way we lead it. That's the first thing. But I would like to come back on that, definition thing, because actually I do think that what matters. And I would agree that we are not in war, because we are perhaps in an ideological warfare, but then we need to frame what is really the thing here. And I think what is the thing here is that we give signals that we want to protect our security, that the West, however you want to call it, has a pretty relative notion of values, which is that our lives stand much over other lives, which is we don't look at the victims in other parts of the world, but we look pretty much on the victims in our part of the world. And there's a certain relativity of sort of what do we care for. And now we have a whole discourse in which we say we defend values and freedom, but actually we are arming ourselves to basically defend our security and our wealth for ourselves. And here I would like to come back to what has been said here with Asiem. If we do not go into the misery, which is basically at the roots of all this radical emergence, then I think we have no chance. So the question is, can we fight this with military means? How much money are we going to spend into military means now, instead of really tackling the roots at the front and putting all these monies into the banlieues of Paris and the banlieues of Brussels, where the misery is?
I want to come back to that point a little bit later on in the program. We have a report about those banlieues, about those districts of both Belgium and France. But first of all, back to a point that Ulrike just made. She said it often looks as if people in Europe believe European lives matter more. Now, with all due respect to the suffering in Paris, Asiem el Difraoui, how do you feel when you witness this immense outpouring of solidarity and alarm after the attacks in France and the comparative indifference with which the recent attacks were met in Beirut?
Mm-hmm. I feel very badly about it, but I also feel very badly about the fact that, for example, the huge show of solidarity which we have seen for the last attacks is not as much solidaire, as the French would say, as we believe. There's a huge friction. And that's why I would like to come back to the war of words. Those people don't want to live like in the West. They want to have human rights, you know, people outside Europe. And they feel very much categorized if we talk about, you know, radical Islam. It's polarizing. And that's the link with what you just said. French society at this stage risks major frictions because French society in itself is not very coherent. ISIS knows very well where the fault lines in European societies are. There hasn't been a huge solidarity movement in France so far. Even around the memorial, improvised memorial in front of the Bataclan, the concert hall, there were huge fights about people accusing Islam, others saying not Islam, white people, other whites as racism because they were looking for roots. So French society is really on the fringe of explosion. It's not too, it's too much, but you know, some huge rift. So if we use like words like to say it's radical Islam, then all those French Muslims feel stigmatized, and we want to avoid stigmatization. It's a matter.
It's their fault. It's their fault. We've spent in Europe. We spent decades arguing and examining ourselves for instance, for the responsibility of Christian anti-Judaism, for the rise of fascism, Nazism, and so on, and for, in the end, for the Holocaust. There's whole libraries of that. But just say once radical Islam, and you have the feeling that all the Muslims in the world got and say, no, this has nothing to do with us.
No,
this is part of the problem.
No, but I mean, it's
I'm not going to have my mouth forbidden, but people will say, you mustn't say radical Islam because then someone somewhere in the banlieue is going to say, well, I feel alienated by that, so I'm going to blow you up.
But there are better words, you know. I mean, if you talk about the responsibility of the Muslim community, if you talk about root causes, you need to talk about this, but you need to be very fine with words.
I'm not talking about responsibility of the Muslim community. I'm talking about radical Islam.
Clearly, it is part of IS's strategy to exploit
What's radical Islam? I'd like to know. Explain to me.
We will come back to the question of how to deal with the domestic potential for recruiting and for lack of integration. But again, I would like to talk about the IS strategy first. Clearly a strategy that aims to exploit exactly the kind of divisions that you're talking about in Western societies. Interestingly enough, many experts believed for a long time that IS wasn't interested in exporting either jihadism or revolution, but in fact in establishing a territorial caliphate in the Middle East. Do the events in Paris represent a shift in strategy by IS? And if so, what implications does that have for the fight to contain IS?
IS controls the territory it occupies with fear and intimidation, and it's no longer limited to the theater of war in Syria and Iraq. Part of its new strategy is sowing terror in other parts of the world. No one should feel safe. The locations of the Paris attacks were chosen deliberately. Many of the victims were young, most under the age of 30. Islamic State is fighting a war against the Western way of life and the values it represents. Terrorist attacks are a way for the group to rally supporters and recruit new militants. As military pressure rises in Syria and Iraq, there's little doubt IS will seek to strike back with more attacks in the West.
Ulrike Guérot, the French are stepping up their airstrikes against IS. They're asking their EU partners for support. Russia apparently has seized upon the opportunity to redeem itself and also wants to get into the fray. But nobody is talking about boots on the ground. Can we really defeat IS by proceeding as we are?
Probably not, and that is not to say that I'm at all means against military solutions, but I think what IS wants is basically that we move out of that asymmetry. What is happening that that we are placing, I think the framing is that there's what they call in the eyes of the ISIS is structural inequality and structural violence, right? Structural violence of society, and they go against with basically direct violence, which is we have diffused violence and they have direct violence. I think this is the asymmetry to understand. And I think what they want to provoke us with is that we are the cowards, which is we are flying with drones, we are flying with airplanes which have no basically people. We put money in it, but no lives. And I think what they want to provoke us is that we basically go on a very sort of, like in ancient societies where pride played a role, Ehre, what is the word of honor, all these words count. And I think there's the cowardness of the West, and that's the Achilles first of the West. It's precisely that we don't go with troops and we don't fight this war on the ground, and we just sort of flying above the war. Yeah.
Asiem el Difraoui, interestingly enough, the attacks in Paris come at a time when IS has actually reached the limits of its territorial expansion and is even looking at a rollback in some areas. It's basically seeing resistance on every border of the territory it has so far. So is this a shift in strategy? Our report implied that the French attacks are sort of a grand recruiting campaign. Do you think that's right?
I think we set a fairly honest tone to our conversation, so I'll continue with that. I'm very shocked by the short-term memory of journalism and all this kind of analysis. I'm extremely shocked by our short-term memory, generally speaking, and by the superficial analysis. We don't know whether ISIS has reached its real territorial expansion or not. I mean, there are other areas we don't really know. This is pure speculation. Secondly, shift in tactics. It's not even strategy. It might be a minor shift in tactics. It's a dangerous, globalized ideology. Mm-hmm. If they, for a year, decide to construct their territorial foothold to better expand later, this is just like, say, pausing themselves to invade better somewhere else. So, I mean, we shouldn't even take these considerations into account. What's important, and what makes me a little upset in terms of people saying all this hyper ISIS specialists, saying, well, you know, they wouldn't have attacked Europe if they would have let them build their territory and let them manage their own territory. No, the adverse thing would have happened. We reacted much too late. Yes. Instead of saying, you know, let them, well, they leave us alone if they do their own thing. No, the contrary would happen. If we would have left them alone for a year, 2, 3, 4 more, we would have seen what happened later. So we cannot tolerate it. So this kind of analysis is completely irrelevant. Jihadism needs to be fought wherever we find it, not only military, but with all other means at our disposal. So now again, I didn't finish this one. So I really didn't finish this one. We need to see jihadism as a long-term problem, which has been there for a long time, and stop focusing on, oh, hey, there's a new threat. The threat has been there for the last 15 or 20 years. Mm-hmm. And let's go into nitty-gritties. Let's focus on ISIS. Look what's going to come out of Yemen tomorrow. Look what's going to happen out of Libya tomorrow.
But what does that tell us for strategy? Can we fight that militarily? Barack Obama has said many times, look, even if we put boots on the ground in Syria and Iraq, what are we going to do when the threat shifts to Yemen? Are we going to send ground troops in there? Are we going to send them into Libya? Is this really a problem that can be solved with military measures?
No, there need to be military measures for some situations. But we need to mobilize all the Western world, in the sense, or everybody who shares our values in this conflict. And there, maybe the Yemeni situation can be solved still with local allies, can be solved by negotiation. Same for Libya. But we need to be aware that we can't wait any longer, and we can't treat these issues like in a piecemeal way. We need to see the whole of this jihadi movement and the whole of the threat and work together with all means at our disposal to fight jihadism.
Alan Posener, Germany's foreign minister, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, said this week that without a really effective political strategy for the region, all the military measures in the world are going to have very limited effectiveness. He has a point, doesn't he?
Yeah, of course he has a point. And of course, what he means is, for instance, that one of the main creators of ISIS was Assad, the Syrian dictator who has claimed many more lives in Syria than IS has, and ISIS is a reaction of radicalized Sunni against a regime supported by Iran and so on. So there's a difficulty there. But the problem is, although you say, Asiem, that there is no piecemeal solution, there is no other than a piecemeal solution. We have to defeat IS now, so that they realize we are not cowards, and then we have to go to solving the Syrian problem, and then we have to turn to the other problems. This is
but for
a
that we need a comprehensive,
task.
we need a comprehensive strategy for. We need a comprehensive strategy for very specific tasks, which are multiple.
Yeah, and then I think it's beyond strategy. It's actually also inclusiveness. If we pretend to have values, then the question is whether we are ready to share these values and to integrate the others in these values and to offer them the same nice life that we have.
Already be able to communicate these values, which we don't seem to be able to communicate.
And that's much about inclusiveness and about sharing. And I think we don't get there if we are 7% of world population spending 0.7% of GDP on development aid and such. And this is much about the bitterness and this sort of relativity of values which we are carrying on with us. So I think that is an ideological warfare, but it has much to do about otherness, accepting otherness, about sharing, and about getting very different policies so that the externalization effects of our own wealth are not thrown out on the rest of the world.
Then let's come back to the point about inclusiveness that all of you made a bit earlier and take a look at those districts of Paris and of Belgium in which inclusiveness clearly isn't happening. Clearly, if we want to cut back on support for ISIS, we have lots of work to do right here at home.
In the search for terrorist suspects, special forces raided locations in Molenbeek. This district of Brussels is viewed as a breeding ground for radical Islamism. Many migrants reside here with little or no perspective for a better life. And there's even less hope in the suburbs that surround Paris, the notorious banlieue. Youth unemployment is over 40% here. Marginalization and exclusion contribute to an underlying rage. It exploded in 2005 when riots and unrest shook the French capital for weeks. Politicians promised improvements, but little has changed for the people of these grim suburbs. There's still glaring reminders of the utter failure of French integration policies. Fighting terrorism has to begin in the banlieue.
Asiem el Difraoui, the one thing that Francois Hollande didn't mention in his speech was integration. Have the French more or less given up? Is France on its way to becoming an apartheid state?
No, Valls, the French Prime Minister, said a couple of months ago, it's an apartheid state. It's true. I mean, there are some people which are not really, which don't at all feel included by French society. Hollande not including the word integration is just very cowardish in a sense. You know, he's paralyzed by the fear of the National Front. As there are regional elections coming up, he knows very well that it's all about integration. He just didn't want to mention the word. This shows you how French politics are paralyzed by the last events, and together with the fact that the National Front is most likely the party in France which gets the most votes. Political courage is lacking. That's a huge thing. Instead of making visionary statements, he does this military vision, but he doesn't provide a huge vision for French society, which is one part of the problem why French society is lacking coherence.
Ulrike Guérot, it's of course not only the far-right Front National, the National Front, that is a potential threat. We're also hearing a lot from the conservative rival, Nicolas Sarkozy. Among other things, he suggested that perhaps all of the 10,000 people on the French terrorist watch list might be detained, perhaps in some form of house arrest. Is France on its way to having its own Guantanamo?
No, I agree. But, you know, there was an ad hoc opinion poll and said on Sunday on the shock, but 67% of French were basically ready to trade a change of the political system against more security. So we see a clear erosion of liberties, civil liberties in France. And I agree with Asiem that the implosion of the French party system and the whole political landscape is really in acute danger. And we are basically 1 year and a half in front of French presidential elections in May 2017, which will be just a really political mess, not only for France, but for Germany, especially because we are the tandem partner of France in the European setting and for Europe in the larger scale.
Alan Posener, Francois Hollande also wants to expel radical imams, close down radical mosques. But if we really want to fight jihadism, as you said in your opening statement, mustn't we start out by talking to our good friends, the Saudis and the Gulf states, who are supporting Wahhabi Islam, radical Islam, with Islamic schools, madrasas, with jihadism itself?
Yeah, we have to talk to the Saudis in no uncertain terms. But we also have to talk to our own populace, our Muslim fellow citizens, and say, look, yes, you're being discriminated. Yes, you're being marginalized, as has every minority, and it's a terrible thing. But Jews for centuries are marginalized. They didn't start blowing people up. The blacks in the United States have witnessed slavery, and they're still don't have equal rights, but they're not blowing people up. So for Allah's sake, stop this. You have to do something about this cancer in your midst.
Thank you very much. Afraid we have to stop right there. Thanks to all of you for tuning in. We leave you with images of some of the destruction that was wrought in Paris and elsewhere.
Let's talk about moderate fascism.
We have moderate.